Let's move then to the question around terms and term limits. First of all, those are usually defined in your bylaws as well. If they're not in your bylaws or your constituting documents, then create them in your governance policies. And frankly, if your bylaws don't tell you anything about terms and terms limit, it's kind of to your advantage, because then you don't have to make a fancy change of your bylaws. You can simply write board governance policy, which the board itself can approve. Your bylaws have to be approved at least by your membership, and in some jurisdictions they also have to be approved by a government authority, usually a provincial or a state government. And so this is something that we want to not have happen. So if we can change it in our governance policies, because there's nothing in the bylaws, then consider yourself fortunate and write some governance policies around terms and term limits. First of all, what is a term? Well, a term is the length of time that a board member is elected to serve. That can be 1 year, it could be 2 years, it could be 3 years. It's rarely any more than 3 years. So I'm elected to your board and I'm elected for a period of years. Most common is a 1-year election. Increasingly common, because we get some good board members and we don't want to lose, is a 2-year term. So that's the length of time that I'm elected to serve, and I don't have to be re-elected every year, because if I'm elected this year, I'm serving for 2 years. If it's a 2-year term, and I don't have to be re-elected the following year. If I'm only elected for 1 year, then I have to be re-elected each year, and we put forward usually a slate, meaning a list of all of the proposed directors to our annual general meeting membership. A term limit then means that we have a number of terms that can be served consecutively by one board member. So a 2-year term, and maybe 3 terms consecutively is our term limit. That's a very common thing. 2-year term, so I'm elected for 2 years, and I can serve 2-year terms 3 times consecutively. And then I usually have to go off, and the most common going off period is either 1 year or 1 term, depending on what your board would prefer. So why is this important? Well, it makes it possible to have orderly transition. So when a board member is termed out, that's usually the colloquial kind of expression that we use, then they leave the board and they have to stay off the board for a period of time. Exiting board members, however, can continue to serve on committees. It's a great way to keep your wonderful, good board members who've got lots of energy and really don't want to go off the board, but they have to. Get them onto committees. So standing committees, ad hoc committees, fundraising committees, whatever you've got going, ask that board member who's retiring from the board to serve on a committee for a year or 2. But I'll just give you just a little best practice tip here, and that is that it's sometimes better to let those board members retire and be off the board. They come back to the board if they would like to, and the board wants them to come back, but they come back refreshed, renewed, invigorated, new ideas. Maybe they've been doing other volunteer work, or just focusing on friends and family and recreation, leisure, travel, whatever it might be. So it's not a bad thing if you have a board member go off for a couple of years and then kind of recharge their batteries and return to the board if you want them to, and if they feel like they would like to. Avoiding changing your bylaws is a good thing. So if you can get your term limits right, it would be really, really helpful. So you need to create a process of terms and term limits that makes sense for you. If you think about 3 2-year terms, that's 6 years, right? Or 2 3-year terms, a little less common, but that's also 6 years. And then the longest that we usually would see is 3 3-year terms, which is 9 years, which is a very long time for a volunteer to serve on the board. So very important then that we have some rotation. Now let's look what that rotation might look like. Here's your ideal board composition. 1/3 of your members are in their first term, so they're just getting started. 1/3 of your members are in their second term, so they basically have stuff figured out, so they've been there between 2 and 4 years. 1/3 of your members are in their final or third term, and usually that is your term limit, and they will exit in a year or 2. So what you can see here is that you're only going to lose 1/3 of your board based on a 2-year term. You're only going to lose 1/3 of your board every other year. So this is a pretty orderly kind of thing. So if you have, for example, 12 board members, you're only going to lose 1/3 of your board, 4 people, and you're going to lose half of those in any given year. So it's pretty reasonable turnover. If you have 2 people coming off the board every year, it's not a big deal. And it doesn't leave your nominating or board development or recruitment committee with this huge, overwhelming task. ask. So, and it also helps board members stay on the board because they kind of feel a commitment for their term. And then if they need to go off, we ask that they go off at the end of their term rather than in the middle of their term. So creates that sense of connection. I'm here for 2 years, I'm here for another 2 years, and an obligation to continue on to be engaged and to not resign. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is executive terms. So we're talking about your directors who are officers of the board, chairperson, vice chairperson, secretary, treasurer, and what their terms and transitions are. Now, the very easiest thing to do is to match your term with 2 years, let's say, most common. Match your term with the term of your officer. So keep those two things consistent. So when the chair is elected, they're elected for 2 years. This gives some leadership stability to the board, but frankly, it also creates some sanity for the executive director because they can build a relationship and they're not ending up with a rookie or a new chairperson or vice chairperson every single year. That causes a lot of drawdown in time in terms of orientation, explaining things, making sure that the board executive are up to speed. So if you have a board executive elected for a 2-year term, that is absolutely the ideal. It makes things really, really simple. So what I'm going to suggest to you then, that the chairperson or the president is often allowed in your bylaws or in your governance policies to serve 1 more year beyond that. So let's suppose that the chairperson is elected for 2 years. Maybe they're re-elected for another 2 years, that's fine. Then they go off the board of their own choice or the board's choice, but they can serve as past chair for 1 more year. So in addition to their terms that they're actually spending on the board as a director, this is a long service for someone to be a volunteer working with your nonprofit. I want to just shift for a second to, we talked about roles and responsibilities, but I want to talk about what happens with the vice chair. They're sometimes in limbo. So there's 2 ways of looking at the vice chair. One is that they are actually a chairperson who is in training. They're the next chairperson of the board. I like this model because it ensures that there's some succession implied in the structure of the board already. So you serve for 2 years as a chair. The vice chair, who's been with you hopefully for 2 years, then steps in and becomes chair. This allows the executive director and senior management to know their board leadership pretty well. They've worked together for 4 years, let's say. And it also allows the board leadership to be stable and predictable in the eyes of the board. So it creates a sense of teamwork. It makes communication easier. You know what's going to happen at board meetings. You have some sense of who is next in the leadership role. So I like it if the board chair or the board vice chair is actually what we call a chair-elect. Meaning that when they are elected as vice chair, we know and expect that they will become the chairperson of the board if you're in a 2-year term cycle, which is what I would recommend, would in fact be 2 years from now. So nice, smooth transition opportunity to make things work well for your board. However, in many organizations, the vice chair is really the person who chairs the meeting if the chair can't attend. And that's kind of a simple way of doing business, but when you think about it, it's a pretty weak structure because it basically says, I do nothing unless the chair misses a meeting. And a chair will miss very few meetings. Most chair people are your long-term, pretty committed board members, and so they're not likely to miss a ton of time. And so the vice chairperson essentially says, that was a pretty easy job. I'm vice chair of the board. Maybe that's a feather in my cap. Maybe it sounds nice as a title, but guess what? I didn't do much. So I like the other model where we actually end up with a chair-elect and a vice chair that becomes a chairperson. Executive can be elected in one of 2 ways. By the membership at the annual meeting, if you have a membership. So you put forward a slate of directors and the executive and the board, and the membership votes on the board and on the executive of the board. That could be 2 different motions if you prefer it to be. And the other choice is that the membership elects the board as a whole, then the board goes into an in-camera session following the annual general meeting and elects the executive. That executive, however, should not be a mystery at that moment in time. The executive appointees should in fact be known to the board, and it should be a very simple motion. So it's usually a 1 or 2 minute meeting, and from the slate of directors that have just been elected, the board elects its executive members. It's a very smooth process. It's usually a very simple process, and it doesn't leave anything to chance. It lets everybody know that we are in fact in a good position and we're ready to take our board forward, and the leadership is known and is established. Now, most of the key relationships then are between the executive director, CEO, and the board chair. The second most important relationship is usually between the executive director and the treasurer of the board. And we very often, if you're a mid to large sized organization, we end up with the treasurer and the finance director, paid senior staff member responsible for the finances of the organization, also tends to have a strong working relationship with the treasurer of the board. In most organizations, the secretary's position is technically the keeper of the records and the corporate seal. Increasingly, we don't even have corporate seals, but periodically we need one for something where a document has to be executed and the signature is covered with a seal. So the secretary is technically responsible for that. However, in practice, the records are usually kept by a paid staff member who records meeting minutes, and the seal is usually kept in the safe or in the drawer of the executive director. So in fact, the secretary in a contemporary modern board very often has a very small role to play. The finance person, the treasurer on your board, is really critical, and I'm going to encourage you to create a succession plan that always has two people capable of being the treasurer and then being the treasurer-elect. So this means that the succession plan for the treasurer is kind of like what I described for the vice chair, and that is you have one person with a finance background who is your current treasurer, and your treasurer-elect is somebody who's also already knows that they can step into that role. Now, I just want to mention the whole idea of shadowing. If you have a chairperson and a chairperson-elect, it makes sense that the chairperson-elect is in a learner role and is in fact shadowing the work of the chairperson, and when they move into the chairperson's position, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's a very easy transition. Should do the same thing for the treasurer position. So the treasurer-elect, who is the upcoming soon-to-be treasurer in 1 or 2 years, depending on your terms, that person should attend finance committee meetings, participate in audit committee if you have one, and they really should be knowing the organization fairly well from a financial perspective. So when I ask questions about board composition, I always ask, how many finance people do you have? If you only have one, find one more, bring them onto the board now, and prepare them by shadowing the current treasurer and working with the finance director to become the treasurer-elect. Now, one of the things we want to do is when we're looking for recruiting executives, then we are always at least 1 year in advance, if not 2 years in advance, depending on the term, whether your executive terms are 1 or 2 years. I like 2 years in advance, although you can lose some of your executive just to simple normal attrition. They get transferred, they get relocated, they have a baby, they get a big new job, and they just simply don't have the time to contribute anymore. So it's important that you think about what is best for our organization. You'll know from your composition of your board. Have an open conversation about what is the best term and how far ahead you should be working on succession for those people. Make sure when you invite new members onto the board that you're very clear with your expectations. We're going to talk about more about that in a few minutes. Don't lie to them about how much time it takes. Don't tell them that there are no issues when there are. Make sure they understand that when the board meetings are, if they have a conflict because they're taking a grad school class on Tuesday evenings and your board meetings are on Tuesday evenings, you just stop right there. There's no point. So you need to be as transparent as you possibly can, as detailed and specific as you possibly can. And if it's a good fit, don't muscle anybody. Don't be putting anybody's arms behind their back to try and get them to serve. They won't attend, they won't have time for you, and they will not be a helpful board member, and you'll end up either losing them or you'll end up with deadwood on your board, neither of which is a good situation. The final thing that I want to just mention is that when we recruit new members onto the board into directors positions, we should be preparing them for the future potential leadership. So we should say, you're coming on as a director, as a member of the board, as a member at large, but we would really like you to consider taking on leadership roles in the future once you get your legs underneath you and you understand the organization a little bit more. This is a really good way of staging the succession process by planting that thought early on in someone's mind. All right, that brings us to the end of this lesson, and I invite you to continue on to the next lesson.